Edit audio.
This episode contains subject matters of violence and sexual assault. Please take care while listening. In the last episode of Ozark's True Crime, the Sandra Hemme story, we left off on the first day of trial. Our team is in Chillicothe, Missouri at the evidentiary hearing for Sandra Hemme. If freed, she would be the longest-serving, wrongfully imprisoned woman in America. Okay, so right now we are starting with our second day, which is Wednesday, and it's 9 a.m. sharp. The trial left off with Detective Steve Fuston on the stand, and court was adjourned before the Attorney General's office cross-examined him. As a quick reminder, Fuston was the lead on Sandy's case, and we've poured over loads of documents he had written. Fuston was a police officer for 3 years when assigned to the Hemme case and a detective for 1 year. It's day 2 of the evidentiary hearing, and I've taken 39 pages of notes at this point, and we hope to have our bases covered since we're not allowed to bring in recording devices of any sort. Our team is standing outside the courtroom. The building is historic and beautiful, with ornate detailing on the ceiling and penny-tiled floors. There's a sign in the waiting area that reads, "Spitting on the floor is positively forbidden by order of county court." Today, Sandy's sisters are 4 rows back and directly in front of me. They bookend Sandy's daughter and granddaughter on the wooden pews. Steve Fuston is sworn in, and the respondents are confirming that he read Sandy her Miranda rights. He said that he actually asked her to read them so that he was sure she understood and was not coerced. They work hard to point this out. But the question that immediately pops into my head is that in one of his reports, Fuston states that Sandy was not coherent or totally cognizant of what was going on, and then stopped the questioning. Would this not raise a red flag? Does Sandy's ability to read from a piece of paper mean that she understands what it says? Fuston tells us that despite having doubts about how coherent Sandy was while being interviewed in the state hospital, that he had Dr. Jack's blessing to do the interview, confirming to him that she was capable. The Attorney General's office pushes him. If Dr. Jacks would have said, "We have to stop this," would you have? Fuston point blank says yes. I look up and see Sandy. Attorney Sean O'Brien is on her left side, and they are speaking to each other. I often see him patting her on the back and asking if she's okay. They now seem to be quietly talking. She looks alert, her eyebrows expressive. The Attorney General's office closes out by asking a series of rapid-fire questions to Fuston about Sandy. During the questioning, was she having convulsions? No, he replies. Was her head falling back? Were her eyes rolling back? Was she making weird movements? No, no, and no.
And what I thought was interesting too about him is reading all those reports. I thought that he was kind of the bad cop who was, relentlessly interrogating Sandy, but throughout his testimony, we kind of saw that he was kind of just one of the cops who was assigned to Sandy's lead. And at one point he did say he stopped interrogating Sandy because he felt like he couldn't get the truth out of the situation. He couldn't actually, figure out what happened. So he told that to Chief Hayes, and then he kind of left it at that. Whereas my understanding before from just the reports was that he was the one who arrested Sandy basically.
Yeah, and I think he was the one who put in the notes that she wasn't lucid and that he didn't feel like he could go on with the interview. It's 10:05 a.m. and the next witness is called to the stand, James L. Trainum. He is retired from the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C., and was a detective from 2000 to 2010. He worked with the FBI on evidence submission protocols and police practices for interrogations. Trainum has written several articles on interrogations occurring in wrongful conviction cases. Trainum has gray shaggy hair, a gray beard, a gray suit, and a blue tie.
I did find Trainum was very comfortable up there. He was speaking with his hands a lot. He had a conversational tone for the first time we had heard. He was very
He was looking back and forth,
like speaking
to the judge. His job, essentially, was to be an expert who's worked on a lot of unsolved cases. Like Dr. Edersheim, he studied documents pertaining to Sandy's case, including lab reports, the crime scene, police reports, and media. The first moment that sticks out to me was when Mr. Trainum was asked about the police questioning. In 1980, Sandy was questioned 8 times over the span of 12 days. Trainum replied, "That's a lot." We then get our answer as to why there was so much talk about the description of Patricia's room and that floral pattern on the bedspread and the pillow. Trainum is handed documents, and he absorbs them for some time. We then learn that the front page of the newspapers in the days after the murder showed images of the crime scene, the bedroom, a photo of Patricia's house from the outside, the exact address where it took place, and descriptions of how the body was found. Trainum says that he had never seen this much detailed information published so early in an investigation. One thing I think that Trainum really focused on, which I thought was so interesting, was the media attention that this case received. And that was a big part of his testimony, was that Sandy's later confession included many of the objects and the images that were shown in the press.
Yes, and this was the first time I had heard that there was also a photo in the St. Joseph Gazette of the front of the house when they were like loading Patricia Jeschke into a vehicle to take away from the crime scene. I hadn't heard anything about the outside of the house, but that could...
And the address.
Yeah, the address was in it.
If you listened to Season 1 of Ozark's True Crime about the Springfield Three, you'll know how much media attention can play into a criminal investigation. Law enforcement in that case felt that the public should not have had access to pertinent information on the crime so early on, and that it could have weakened their investigation. And why is this important in Sandy's case? It was only after she was shown images of the crime scene that she was able to describe details from it. Trainum also made a note to mention that in some of the photo evidence, there were loads of plants in boxes along the north and west walls of Patricia's apartment, so much that it looked like a greenhouse, he said. But when Sandy described the apartment to police, she made no mention of the plants. She only mentioned details that were in the newspapers and photographs shown to her by police at the crime scene. And I think you know what I'm going to say next. There were no plants in these photographs.
She couldn't remember certain things about the house, but apparently she had like been there many times. So it's like those little details you would probably remember if you were in a space.
The details that she remembered were all in the press photos, I think, too, is what Trainum was coming back to, is like the things that she told police were like visible in the newspaper. Like you said, stuff like the outside of the house was taken in a photograph and like the address was there. And so the fact that she could lead police to the house is not saying much because that was in the newspaper at the time anyway.
Something else really interesting comes out, and that's that a man by the name of Bobby Cummings wrote a letter to Sandy while she was in jail awaiting trial. Cummings said that he picked up Sandy on November 12th and dropped her off in Dearborn. Cummings closely resembled the man Sandy described in her initial statements to police, the man she called Joe, that picked her up and drove her to Dearborn.
When Sandy originally talked to police and described the man that drove her either all the way or partially to Dearborn, it was like this man had a mustache and looked this particular way. Mm-hmm. And she said that the man's name was Joe, but didn't give the last name. That was in like one of the first interrogations. And I have the note here that says Joe Wobski does not at all match the description of who Sandy initially described to police. But then in the subsequent interrogation, it becomes Joe Wobski. And I thought that was interesting because she initially gives this description.
Yeah, and I have that Bobby Cummings actually does fit that description.
Okay, yeah.
Trainum also says that based on the thousands of burglaries he's worked, sexual assaults and murders that occur during a burglary usually occur when the burglar is surprised or caught off guard. The defense's questioning ends with the Innocence Project asking Trainum a series of questions. Are sexual crimes mostly committed by men? Yes, he replies. Was there any physical evidence tying Sandy to the crime? No, he says. And is there anything else aside from her own confession that ties Sandy to the crime? He says no. It's 12:45 p.m. and the Attorney General's office is working to discredit Trainum. They want to show that he wasn't there when all of this happened and was not assigned to this case, that he had never interviewed any of the detectives, witnesses, or the police chief. The respondents then introduced a document from a woman named Donna Morris, who was also a patient at the St. Joseph State Hospital, stating that she overheard Sandy say that she had killed Patricia and that she was trying to trick the police. This was never brought up again, possibly because of the credibility of this woman. The Attorney General's office is doubling down on showing what they believe is Sandy's penchant for violence, and things that she has said, like that she liked blood more than playing with her kid.
The respondent kind of kept bringing up these statements that Sandy was making, like violent statements. I like watching violence more than I like my kid. That was a statement they brought up. But then while I was listening to this, I was just like, James Trainum is only there to talk about police practices and interrogations. In no way is he the person to be responding to what these statements from Sandy mean. Like, that would be Dr. Edersheim, who like understands mental health and Sandy's diagnoses. Like, I thought that was kind of strange and weird that actually Innocence Project didn't object to like that being outside of his scope.
The amount of energy and like there's obviously people are feeling strongly about this case and kind of like what happened. There was a lot of talking over each other. So I remember, I think it was at the end of this witness's testimony where they were kind of doing the cross-examination and then they would return the witness. And then at one point, the judge calls everyone up to the bench and there was a bit of a kerfuffle, and sort of through the noise, I just heard him say, "This is a trial, not a free-for-all." Mm-hmm. And then I think after that, they excused the witness.
We'll be right back after this quick ad break. It's 1:55 p.m. and the next witness is called. Timothy Schweder, a retired police chief at the St. Joseph Police Department who was a patrol officer in 1980 when Patricia was murdered. He also worked on the Eric Christian case in which Melvin Lee Reynolds was wrongfully convicted.
He also did a lot of the sketches about like Michael Holman's truck, or like the truck that was seen, which this was interesting. The sketch of the pickup truck from 1980 was that, is this correct that it was based on hypnosis of a boy who had seen the truck?
It was so wild.
Yeah, he was saying that like the police department had learned of these new ways to get information of people that involved hypnotism, which one thing I thought that was just totally wild, but also that it was mentioned very quickly and then we moved right on and it was glossed over. Schweder's testimony included a thorough timeline of Patricia's whereabouts on the day she was murdered. He had multiple eyewitness accounts of co-workers who placed Patricia at the library during her lunch break at 1 p.m. that day, and then about 5 p.m.
In one of the multiple statements that we got from her co-workers about Patricia that day, one of them described her clothing, and it was like, again, we haven't had that many visuals of Patricia, and they described her as wearing a 3-piece pantsuit, slacks, vest, and a jacket that were black, white, and gray plaid with a white blouse.
She told one coworker that she had a religious class that night at the Catholic Church. Another coworker confirmed seeing Patricia at 4:15 p.m.
Yeah, it was like she was tired, she couldn't go home and rest because she had to go to this class.
A handful of these people he interviewed had heard Patricia tell stories about her dating life. Patricia had been married in the past, and you'll hear more about that later. It's 2:55 p.m. Judge Patrick Robb is sworn in, but before doing so, the Innocence Project team tells the judge that they have a witness that is only available today and should take just 10 minutes. There's some back and forth between the two, but it looks like we can expect to see 2 more witnesses today. Robb currently serves as a circuit judge, but was the assistant prosecuting attorney in Buchanan County in 1980 under Mike Ensko, who was the prosecuting attorney. Robb worked Sandy's case and was called to come out to the crime scene at Patricia's, and he was eventually the one to try Sandy's case in 1985. One of the first things that was brought up was Melvin Lee Reynolds, who was wrongfully accused, which we talked a lot about in episode 3. Rob was a vocal advocate for Reynolds and assisted in his release. As a reminder, the police chief at the time of both Melvin and Sandy's cases was Chief Robert Hayes, and a decent amount of time was devoted to Hayes here. Rob spoke about Hayes' involvement in Melvin's case and in Sandy's, and how unusual it was. He also made a point to say how unhappy Chief Hayes was with him when he advocated for Melvin's exoneration. He said that he was nervous about Chief Hayes. Attorney Sean O'Brien made mention of Rob saying that Hayes was known as a glory hound, and then asked him if Chief Hayes could be trusted. Rob said, "I didn't trust him. That was my personal experience. I did not trust him."
I have here, he said, "I never felt comfortable with him. I felt he directed the case with Melvin Reynolds."
And we heard similar sentiments about Chief Hayes' character during this hearing. Also from Rick Hartigan. You might remember him from episode 1. He's the journalist who worked at the local news station and covered Sandy's case. Rick told us a disturbing story about what happened to him when he released a TV report revealing crucial evidence that was missing from Sandy's case.
2 days before Sandra Hemme's initial trial was to begin, I ran a television news story that revealed that Miss Hemme's defense attorney did not have 2 critical pieces of evidence. One being that a pubic hair from a black male was discovered on Miss Jeski's body. The second being that a black male, Michael Holman, the St. Joseph police officer, used Miss Jeski's credit card in Kansas City the following day to buy camera equipment.
Rick was tipped off by a source that he won't reveal to this day. And what he reported was true. These are facts of the case that are coming to light all these years later. But at the time he reported it in 1981, he experienced significant blowback, including harassment and threats from police.
After I ran that story, I was harassed repeatedly for quite a long period of time by the police department. I had an investigator who told me that the chief of police had told whom, I don't know, that I needed to be killed, and this investigator offered to give me a gun and show me how to use it so that I could protect myself. Left kind of a bad taste in my mouth. In hindsight, 20, 30, 40 years later, I really attribute that attitude and what I'm going to say is corruption of that department on the chief of police himself.
Now back to Judge Rob's testimony. There's confirmation that this was a very high-profile case, and about the images in the newspapers.
They were really talking about the details that appeared in the press, and that there were 8 articles in the first 2 weeks after the murder with a ton of the details. I think Judge Rob, in part of his decision-making for why the guilty plea wouldn't be overturned, or like that 1985 trial, was that Sandy's confession contained details that only the killer would know. Then they say, well, there were 8 articles in the first 2 weeks with the details of like the flower bedspread, the telephone cord, the blue and white pillowcase, the strangulation that Pat was found in the nude. And then Judge Rob says it does diminish the argument.
Sean asked Rob if he had ever witnessed another case involving a lone female committing a murder with such violence of another female. Rob says no. Attorney Sean O'Brien questions if there is any evidence that puts Sandy at the scene. Rob says no. I would guess that Attorney Sean O'Brien and Judge Rob know each other. They seem comfortable in conversation, especially when Sean brings up the good old days.
Sean O'Brien was sort of like, this was back in like the good old days when it was sort of like, more fast and loose and like things relied on trust. And he stopped him and said, I wouldn't call it the good old days. I'd actually call it the bad old days.
And I get his point on this. He also said that the FBI had asked for better prints of Michael Holman, and Rob said that he had never received those.
Yeah. What was the destruction of evidence?
I just have...
Destruction of evidence was a stressor for him.
That's
I
exactly
called
what I have.
and they said it had been destroyed.
Yeah, because he found out in 85 when he was preparing for the trial that they had destroyed a bunch of the original evidence. And so it was like the rape kit from the autopsy was destroyed, the CPO jacket was destroyed.
And DNA from the cord.
And the cord.
Yep. At 5:20 p.m., the Attorney General's office cross-examines Rob, pointing out that he was not a detective at the time and pointing out that it was 40 years ago that this all happened. It's a common phrase that's been used over and over in their questioning. At 5:25 p.m., Attorney Sean O'Brien approaches the stand to confirm that Rob didn't receive crucial files. Sean asked if he believed that Michael Holman was indeed cleared, to which Rob answered no. The witness is dismissed. It's now 5:30 p.m., which is surprising. Judge Horstman is known for not letting hearings go past 5. Our hands are cramping from notes, and our backs are stiff from sitting in these wooden benches all day. But we're all incredibly anxious to see who this next witness is, that Attorney Poocher said could only be here today and would take just 10 minutes. In the next episode of Ozark's True Crime, the Sandra Hemme story, we're going to hear from that witness and hear exactly what she had to say about Patricia. The Sandra Hemme story is part of the Edit Audio original series Ozark's True Crime. It is written and hosted by me, Ann Roderick Jones. This episode was produced by Ali Sirwa and Kathleen Speckert and was edited, mixed, and mastered by Ali Sirwa. Additional editing by Maria Passingham. Our executive producer is Steph Colburn. Thank you immensely to the entire Edit Audio team and to Patrick Rendell for the theme music. If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at hello@editaud.io. That's HELLO@EDITAUD.io.